Welcome, everybody. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to the second session in our conference series, where, as we have with across the whole of the series, focusing on the power of governments and how they can influence the continuous change that ensures equality for all. So throughout this session, we're putting the spotlight on what blocks young children from deprived backgrounds from accessing the advantages of their peers, what common issues lead to our young people becoming marginalised in the education system, and to explore what system changes will make the biggest difference to address these inequalities. We certainly want to make sure that you all engage with this session. We're not putting you all online and visually, but we very much want to encourage you to use the Q&A to pose your questions. And we'll be keeping attention to those and bringing those into the discussion and debates that we have. We are also recording the session and we will share that video with you very soon afterwards. By way of reminder for the audience returning and for those who are new today, the first session last week opened with Hashi Mohammed, where he reflected on his own life story, what issues had hindered his learning, and why it will take more than an education system to tackle social mobility. And he was very articulate in saying there's a lot of weight put on the education system alone to address these big social issues. He particularly highlighted three priorities that he felt would make the biggest difference, namely investing in the first 4 years of children's lives, giving local authorities the power to build affordable housing, and the third one about giving young people experiences, and I emphasize all expenses paid, is what he said, that would widen their horizons at a much younger age than might otherwise do so. So today we're joined by Loic Menzies, education and youth sector specialist and author of Young People on the Margins. I've followed Loic's work for many years and been absolutely fascinated by how his ideas have developed over those years. So be assured he'll get under the skin of the issues that lead to children becoming marginalised in the education system and in society. Loic will also focus on the actions that can be taken at practitioner and national policy level today in addressing some of these issues. And after Loic's keynote, which will be about 25 minutes, we're going to open up the discussion with a panel who've been selected to bring a further insight to today's theme, and they'll be chaired by Stephen Hall. So I'm not going to say anything further and really hand over to Loic, who's going to start us off. Thank you, Loic.
Fantastic, and it's great to be here. I'm really looking forward to meeting some of you in the discussion that we have at the end of what I've got to say. And to set the scene and introduce myself a bit, I guess the journey of learning that I'm hoping to share with you today is one that started back when I was about 13 years old, and I was sat in an assembly with hundreds of other pupils at my school, and someone from the city council came in and announced that there was a new programme to try and involve young people in decisions that affected them in the city of Cambridge, where I lived. And I'd always been quite interested in politics and in decision making and stuff, so I immediately signed up. And what that meant was that I started going along to lots of youth and community centres in the city, and quite often in the sort of more disadvantaged northern fringe of the city. And what I found there was that I met all sorts of young people who I didn't get to know otherwise. And what I noticed was that some of those young people were the pupils who were in my classes, but who always sat at the margins of that classroom. And yet somehow there they were, volunteering to give up their spare time, and they were deeply engaged in discussions about these big decisions that affected them. And it sort of led me to really wonder what was going on there, and to observe the youth workers who were working with them and to see what they were doing, and to notice the slightly different way they were engaging the young people and what they were doing there. And that journey led me, once I became too old to be a young person, unfortunately, when I was 17, I decided what I'd do is I would become a youth worker myself. And so I got to learn all sorts of skills, which I think I hold with me to this day. And I learned from really skilled practitioners. But at the same time, I thought, well, why isn't this translating over into schools? So what happened was that once I finished university, I decided, right, well, I'm going to give it a go myself. I'm going to become a teacher. So I went into the classroom, became a teacher, with a hope that perhaps I could translate what I'd learned as a youth worker into that setting. But somehow it didn't quite turn out like that. And that's one of the things I'm going to be talking to you a bit about today. And actually, after a few years, what I started to ask myself was what was going on at a system level, and what was going on in government, and the decisions that affected schools and young people and the education system, and why that was making so many of these young people to find themselves in these marginalised situations, which is why I've then moved into the world of policy and research. And at each stage of that journey, I've learned new things and shifted my opinions and really come to hopefully a deeper understanding of what we can do to support these young people on the margins better. And that's what I want to share with you today. So before I go any further, you'll notice I used the phrase of the margins there, young people on the margins, several times there. And it's also the word that I used to name this book that Maggie mentioned, Young People on the Margins, which I wrote a year or so ago. And the reason I use that phrase is because the young people that I'm referring to when I say that, they go by quite a lot of different names. So sometimes we call them disadvantaged or underprivileged or vulnerable. Sometimes we almost try and predict their future. We say, oh, these are the young people who are at risk of exclusion. Or we have specific measures, specific government measures, categories that are set out, like pupil premium or special educational needs. But the thing is, I think that ultimately it's all a lot more complicated than that. And sometimes those labels don't bring out that nuance. Whereas for me, the phrase on the margins does that a bit better, because partly it's not a binary. So you can be more on the margins or you can be less on the margins. And hopefully when we use the phrase on the margins, it forces us to think about that and to think how far on the margins a young person is. And the things I want to talk about today are the things that I think we might be able to do to bring young people a bit more in from the margins, and certainly to ensure that even if they're on the margins, they don't become marginalised. So during my 12 years as Chief Exec at the Centre for Education and Youth, where I was working on research and policy with people like Maggie, my job was to bring people together, to bring young people, policymakers, governors, professionals in the education sector together, to talk about these young people. But what I was never really comfortable about was that quite a lot of the time we found ourselves concentrating on a specific issue or a specific group. And so what I wanted to do was that I really wanted to look beyond that and to try and say, what if we look at all these different groups of young people and all these different issues, are there any cross-cutting themes? Is there anything that connects them? Because my hope was that if we could find these cross-cutting threads, then perhaps those could act as clues that might lead us, like on a detective mission, towards the answers that might help us to support these young people better. And that's what I want to share with you today. So to do that, I want to start off by thinking about the typical school. And of course, this might not be how things happen in your school, but it's what I typically see as I go from school to school conducting the research I do. And it's the things I saw in the schools I worked in myself. And what I notice is a bit like what I was saying about the research projects. Schools tend to have different people who are responsible for different things. So you might have someone who's in charge of literacy. And so their job is to look at all the pupils' literacy scores, their reading scores, and to spot anyone whose scores are somewhere off the margins of acceptability, and then to come up with an action plan to say, what are we going to do about this? What intervention can we put in place to bring that pupil's scores back within the margin of acceptability? And the good thing is that often that works. But the problem is that a few years later, sometimes something else starts to come up. So perhaps we see that young person's attendance starting to slip. They're just not coming into school. And there's a lot of focus on attendance at the moment, but we don't know why. So we get along someone who's perhaps in charge of attendance. And you can see this, the government has just announced a pilot of attendance mentors. So now we're going to have someone who's in charge of trying to mentor pupils about their attendance, to do something to improve their school attendance. And maybe that will work, maybe it will be successful. But what happens next? Maybe a few years later, their behaviour starts to deteriorate. And suddenly that pupil is causing disruption in a classroom. And then the school has to start making some tricky decisions. Does it keep putting more resources into that pupil who's disrupting? Or do they start to concentrate on the 29 other pupils in that class who are suffering as a result? It's a classic tension in the system. And I just feel like we haven't yet confronted that and dealt with that as we need to, because too often we're looking at these things in distinct, separate ways. And I know that back when I was a youth worker, I'd be looking at that one young person and saying to myself, well, why aren't the teachers doing more to support them? Why aren't they managing to bring out the best in them? And yet, as I said, things felt a bit different once I was the other side. Once I was a teacher and I was responsible for teaching 700 different pupils a week, I couldn't help thinking, what can I do but do my best for as many pupils as possible and hope that something's in place to support those who are on the margins. But here's the thing. If as leaders and governors and teachers, we can't be confident that when a pupil needs help, action's going to be taken by those who are responsible for that, we're hardly going to throw up our hands in resigned despondence. Instead, we try and take action ourselves. We try to do our best to patch up the cracks that are maybe left over by cut back CAM services or stretched CAM services, a stripped back youth sector. And we're seeing more and more of that at the moment, with schools opening food banks, providing pupils with school uniforms, washing those uniforms, providing holiday food. There's one head teacher recently said that they feel that we've now reached a point where schools have become part of the welfare state. And that's a really unenviable challenge for any school to have to take on. So let's now turn to those clues that I mentioned, those results of a detective inquiry that hopefully can lead us to a solution where we can provide better support for these pupils who are on the margins. And so there's four themes that came out of this work looking across these different groups. And the first is what I like to refer to as demarginalising schools. And often people in school can be quite isolated from the wider landscape of support. Even as someone who'd worked on both sides of the youth work school divide, I know that when I went from being a youth worker to a teacher, I stopped taking the train up to Leicestershire to go to the National Youth Agency's headquarters and started taking the train instead to Nottingham to go to the National College of School Leadership, which hadn't yet been abolished. Now, two cities in the Midlands, but they felt a world apart. And this was an example of a divide we see between schools and other parts of the sector, which so many are trying their best to try and patch up and bring back together now. But that divide is why when a policymaker asked me what I'd do if I had a magic policy wand that I could just wave and make any change with, I sort of let my imagination run wild. And what I said is, imagine if all schools had a group access, they knew they had this entitlement to a group of paraprofessionals, a small team of people like youth workers, social workers and family liaison, who could provide universal, informal and trusted contact and support, able to signpost to help pre-crisis point without all of that resting with teachers. Imagine how much that would change things, not just for young people on the margins, but actually for all pupils within the school community. Imagine how it would shift our ability to support all young people to make a fulfilling transition to adulthood. Well, the exciting thing is that I think since that magic wand conversation a year or two back, I think something like that is starting to emerge. So in the school's white paper, we see that there's a promising sign of commitment to things like enrichment activities and holiday clubs. If we look at the recently published Children's Social Care Review, we see for calls for schools to be used as hubs for multidisciplinary family help teams, who families can come to know and trust, and who can offer services tailored to neighbourhood needs based on detailed assessment. Now, I know that many of you who've been in the sector for a while will be thinking to yourselves, didn't we have a lot of this under Every Child Matters and things like extended schools? And I think that may well be the case. But on the plus side, I'm genuinely excited by the fact that this seems to indicate a bit of a shift in what I call the policy zeitgeist. Things are starting to move on. And what I'm hoping is that these sorts of shifts could build on some of the green shoots that over the last decade or so, we've been documenting at the Centre for Education and Youth. And those things, really, those green shoots, they demonstrate what's possible. So in my colleague Will's chapter of the book, which focuses on children who come into contact with social services, he talks about the findings of a study being run by the What Works Centre for Children's Social Care in Lambeth, Southampton and Stockport. And that pilot is embedding social workers within schools, and hopefully some of the schools in Hackney might have that arrangement too, because it's exactly the sort of thing we might see more of following the Children's Social Care Review. And if you look at the findings from that pilot, they do show that the approach is already reducing the number of child protection inquiries in those boroughs. CfEY also supported Janice Allen, who's head teacher of Faylinge Park School up in Rochdale. And she told us about the partnership she's building with youth services, police, substance abuse teams, and so on, all in order to try and tackle some of the youth violence in her community. Earlier this month, I was hearing about Somerset's inclusion partnership boards, where some heads are coming together to look at crew capacity across the area, so that their schools can take collective responsibility for ensuring that everyone is playing their part in supporting young people who are at risk of exclusion. And I'm sure that each of you here will have a range of partnerships that go beyond your school gates. But what I think is that there's also some different ways of approaching this. So I recently wrote a series of articles in which I set out 3 different approaches that I've seen across the sector. And each of those, I think, comes with a set of advantages and disadvantages. So I'm going to run through those 3 now, and I call them partnering, commissioning, and delivering. So when I talk about partnering, what I'm referring to is what Janice and members of that Inclusion Partnership Board were doing. So working more closely with other organisations. And it's that type of Every Child Matters style support. What we need to remember, though, is why that approach fell out of favour. And one of the reasons is that people do get frustrated with the amount of time it means spending in meetings. I was talking to a teacher from Peterborough just a couple of days ago who was complaining about exactly that, saying, you know, I'm sat in these meetings that go on for hours and yet no action seems to come from them. And that was a repeated call during that comes up with some of these types of approaches. And we can see that there's calls in the Children's Social Care Review for schools to become statutory safeguarding partners. So that might bring more of these kind of meetings into play. There's a proposed legal requirement for councils to introduce local inclusion plans, which is set out in the Sen Green paper. And so this approach does seem to be coming back into vogue. We can see it in the school's white paper too, with the requirement for MATs to work collaboratively with local partners. So it looks like we might be going down that road again, and I think that's definitely to be welcomed. But I do think we need to be vigilant of some of the risks that come with when we can start to treat some of the meetings as an outcome in themselves, or where no one actually takes ultimate responsibility for the problem and no responsibility for the solution. It can sometimes be sort of left up in the air, and we need to have that degree of accountability at the same time. The second approach is what I call commissioning, and it's almost the opposite. There, what we're talking about is where schools will be responsible themselves for procuring services or interventions that focus on specific problems, things like mental health or literacy. And I think that's often the go-to approach that schools take when they're looking at how to deploy the pupil premium. Because the advantage there is that you're really funneling funding towards pupils' greatest needs, and it can be quite accountable and responsive, and it also means you can make the most of specialist expertise. The flip side, though, is that it can also lead to quite siloed support that doesn't join the dots between different needs. And it can mean that no one keeps sight on the young person themselves, just on a specific need. And on top of that, schools aren't always experts in procurement, and it's not always easy to identify those needs and find the best provision. So there's downsides to that approach too. And the third approach is delivering. And there I'm talking about schools just expanding their remit, becoming part of the welfare state, where they can find the resources to do that. So I was speaking to the head at Sir George Monod College in Walthamstow, who exemplified that approach when he said that students arriving in the borough from other countries during Key Stage 4 and 5 were making really rapid progress, a trend you can also see in schools in Hackney. But they were only able to do that once they overcame things like language barriers, and they were able to navigate the bureaucracy of housing and benefits. So the college just went ahead and secured funding to develop additional provision that was adapted to their needs. And what David, the head, said was that his preference was for that because it meant he could employ the staff himself and make sure that the work meshed neatly with the college's curriculum. So he felt that that provided consistency. And delivering wider support directly like that can mean that this provision is really student-centered, that the school who understands that young person can really map the support around their needs. The downside, of course, is that it's not always easy to secure the funding for that. And there is a risk, as one head put it, that you can end up becoming your own LA and being isolated from the people you should be partnering with, so that you don't get the best of the benefit of the links between specialisms. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of those 3 approaches. But the point is that I think each of them has its own advantages and disadvantages. And as governing bodies, I think you need to be quite robust in asking yourselves, which of it is the best strategy to meet different needs, and how do you want to pursue this? So now I'll turn to the second theme from a book, which I call Demarginalising the Margins Themselves. And this comes from the fact that, as I said earlier, what I like about the phrase marginalised is that it's not a binary, and it forces us to ask, how marginal does someone need to be before they become marginalised, or before they get access to support? And this is what is often called the problem of thresholds. So I remember one morning back in 2015 when I was chairing a roundtable in Parliament about mental health. And I remember there was a parent there who told the horrible story of how her daughter had attempted to take her life, only to be told that the attempt was not serious enough for her to be entitled to support. And it was only when she made a second attempt that she finally got access to the support she needed. And for me, that's a really horrifying example of this issue of thresholds of need that really plague our system. And we can see that a huge number of young people are affected by this problem of thresholds. The charity Action for Children estimated that 64,000 children a year are turned down as not meeting the threshold for support from social services, but are then re-referred within a year. And I just think of that number, and I think of all those young people who've missed out on the support they needed during that time, and how much their situation will have deteriorated whilst they were waiting to meet the threshold for help. And unfortunately, I think when we wait until young people reach crisis point, that's when we end up having to rely on really expensive, ineffective, and inefficient emergency responses. And the same thing happens when we see heads and governors having to collude with parents to exclude a child because it's the only way of a child actually accessing the support they need. To me, it seems that if we want young people on the margins to succeed, then we can't wait for or even push them further onto the margins before they get access to support. We have to lower these thresholds of support. And that's why I think we should actually back the Send Green paper's call to tackle what it describes as a vicious cycle of late intervention, low confidence, and inefficient resource allocation. So there is this desire, certainly, in government to address that, but that's going to take a long time, and we really don't see the concrete plans that are needed to change that. So in the meantime, what can schools do? Well, that roundtable was part of a project with an organisation called Minds Ahead, and who knows whether it's the right approach yet, but what they've been doing is introducing a master's level school specialist mental health programme so that you can have that lighter touch, expert early support within a school before young people reach that threshold of need. And I guess in a way, that's an example of that delivering model that I mentioned earlier on. Another response is to pay more attention to pupils near the threshold who have multiple vulnerabilities. So I recently hosted a roundtable where someone told me about a school where all pupils were traffic lighted according to different needs. And what they found was that it was only when pupils were flagged as red that they were getting support. And yet, if they looked at the data more carefully, they realized that there were lots of pupils who were being flagged as amber in several areas. So what they did was start to pay a bit more attention to them. And what they found was that those pupils were actually in just as bad a situation and just as much in need as help as pupils who had a red flag in one area. So I think ultimately, if we can reduce thresholds of need and intervene earlier, then pupils won't need to keep hitting the extremes of the margins before they can access help. The third theme I want to talk about is a really fundamental one, which I think jumps out actually from pretty much every page of Young People on the Margins. And it's the issue of child poverty. And as governors in Hackney, you'll only be too aware of the increasing number of families this affects. Yet I don't think we can afford to forget that child poverty is not inevitable. And as the chief executive of the Child Poverty Action Group said, poverty is policy responsive. And in the past, our governments have tackled this problem and reduced child poverty. And I think it's something that they can take action on again. And the pressure is mounting for there to be action in this area. So I think it's really important that anyone who's involved in the education system, who sees the impact of child poverty every day in their schools, adds their voices to the call for robust action on this issue. And that might mean all sorts of different things, like backing the recent call from the government's own food advisor to raise the threshold for free school meals above £7,000 a year. Similarly, there are lots of schools that are well placed to articulate the case for changing rules on child benefits so that third and fourth children will be eligible for benefits and brought into the safety net. And in other cases, it's students themselves who are getting their voices heard. So up in Wembley, pupils marched on the Football Association to demand that contractors like their parents were paid the living wage. So we can see that as part of youth social action projects, for example, we can encourage our pupils to get involved in calling for change here. But perhaps where schools can have a most direct impact is when it comes to costs, because of course, poverty is not just about income, it's also about costs, as we're seeing with the cost of living crisis. And this is where initiatives like poverty proofing the school day might come in, because those are all about auditing and mitigating the sometimes surprising costs that are associated with schools. And if we look at research by the Children's Society, we can see that an estimated 1 million families have had to cut back on food and other basics due to the cost of school uniform. So the lens of poverty can help us to see all sorts of things differently, like the fact that affordable after-school activities aren't just about enrichment, they can also cut childcare costs and allow families the freedom to take on much needed work. So making enrichment inclusive has surely got to be a big priority for schools in the coming year. Just the other day, Radio 3 featured some research on the socioeconomic gap in music GCSE outcomes, arguing that poorer pupils' difficulties accessing activities like orchestras was making it harder for them to excel in performance as part of their GCSE exams. So while schools have increasingly prioritised curriculum design in recent years, they haven't always looked at it through the lens of poverty and accessibility. And I think all schools need to make sure that they're making all decisions with a view to the question of poverty. And that brings me to my fourth and final theme that I want to talk about today. And that comes from the recognition that being on the margins isn't necessarily the same as being marginalised. So over the course of my work, both inside and outside of the classroom, I've had the privilege of meeting young homeless people, young people in care, Gypsy, Roma and traveller young people, young carers, all sorts of different groups of young people. And yet across all of them, what I hear time and again is that more than anything else, what they really wish is that someone had known and understood a bit more about their story. So in one study, I met Jerome, who was a young carer for his grandparents, but unfortunately, when they passed away, he ended up finding himself homeless, slap bang in the middle of his A-levels. And what he said was that what would have really made a difference for him is if teachers had actually knew that he was a young carer. And yet it turns out that so many young people from all sorts of different backgrounds have things like caring responsibilities that their school actually knows nothing about. And his sense, Jerome's sense, was that what had happened is he'd ended up being invisible in school. And yet that's such an easy thing to happen, because when you have a whole class or many classes to teach, the idea of getting to know everyone really, truly can actually become quite overwhelming and impossible. And we see sometimes that we undervalue pastoral roles like the form tutor, who can provide that continuity and contact and the foundations of relationships. It can also play out in spending decisions, where we focus quite a lot on time-limited interventions that can seem efficient and can make it feel like we're taking action. Yet sometimes they prioritize that over those relationships, when really true efficiency only really comes when we understand the young person and the reality of their needs. So although I think governors have got a lot better at asking questions about evidence and value for money, perhaps they need to take a little bit more of an eye to thinking about the importance of those lasting relationships that allow professionals to get to the heart of young people's stories. Because unfortunately, otherwise we can end up working so hard on the issues that it's easy to lose sight of the young person who's in front of us. And over my time as a youth worker, as a teacher, and as a researcher, I've sometimes been left wondering whether young people are only really on the margins when they're alone. So yeah, those are the thoughts that I've sort of come to from looking across these different groups. And I think that what would be really helpful is to hear your sense of whether those thoughts have resonated and what kind of questions it's raised for you. And I look forward to exploring them a bit more during our panel and Q&A.
Loic, that was fantastic. My goodness, you got under the skin, and it was a bit uncomfortable getting under the skin, but that's exactly why we invited you here. What we're going to do is bring in Stephen, who's going to chair, and the three other panel members now. And to just say to the audience, please don't forget, you can ask questions. So you can pose them right away based on what you've heard Loic say, and also as the next session continues. So I don't want to sort of stop the pace at all. I want to pause for a moment in thinking about what Loic said, but I'm going to hand over to Stephen so you can pick up on this next part. Gosh, gosh, that's what I want to say. Caught me. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie, and thank you, Loic, as well. Lots to think about there in terms, a lot of familiarity in terms of message as well, both in the needs of young people that you're outlining there. I think colleagues across Hackney that resonates very clearly with, but also the school responses and the challenges for schools in responding to that, but also the agency perhaps that school governors and schools have in really making a difference and demarginalising the margins, as you put it. It's not easy to say, and it's the first time I've said it, so I'm quite proud that it came out. So I'm joined by, along with yourself, Loic, I'm joined with by three other panelists. So just like to briefly introduce them, and then I'll ask them to tell you a little bit about themselves. The first person is Deborah Robinson, who's our Parent Engagement Systems Leader. Thank you for joining us, Deborah. Also, we're joined by Neela Morgan, who's the head teacher at Grasmere Primary School, and Dilwar Hussain, who's a young Hackney governor, and also has a representation in terms of being a Hackney learner, which is a really helpful perspective for us. So first of all, I'm just going to move over to Deborah and ask Deborah, do you mind just giving us a little brief introduction about your context in this conversation?
My remit obviously is supporting schools to engage parents, and I think language is pivotal, and I think you have really acutely differentiated being marginalised and on the margin, and how schools can sometimes compound that perception of a child based on whether it's their socioeconomic background, involvement of parents. But my role is to support leaders in engaging parents in a variety of ways. And I actually think going forward, that notion of children being marginalised is very much in keeping with how their parents are perceived. My background is education. I was an English teacher and then an assistant vice principal in a really high performing academy in Hackney. I was born in Hackney and I grew up in Hackney, and my understanding of the context is such that I've seen, you know, whereby if children are left to the very end, you can be at risk of becoming a school full of interventions in the latter part of their education. And actually, it is about early intervention. And we know, without wanting to use deficit models, we know what some of those signs are. We actually have to you know, find opportunities across the academic year and ensure that we also embrace and capitalize on large events to intervene quite early, whether or not I think a child comes with you know, a whole host of information from Key Stage 2. So I've not necessarily talked about myself, but that's a little bit of my take in terms of where we are, that the parents need to also come on this journey of being demarginalised as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. I think you've ably explained very relevant background and history to this conversation, so it's very welcome. Thank you. And if I could move over to Neela. Neela, would you mind just giving us a little bit of background about yourself too?
Hi, yeah, well, I've been in education now for 22 years, but before that I worked in mental health, and so listening to you, Loic, one of the reasons I came into education was I worked with women in mental health and saw them with their children and could immediately see from tiny what that journey was going to be for children, and I really wanted to change that. I came to Hackney in September. It's my first headship, and actually one of the things that attracted me to Hackney is that these conversations are at least on the table, and I've been in other boroughs where they're not even on the table yet, and they are genuinely on the table in Hackney. One thing that I have really tried to do this year as head is equity has been sort of at the core of what we do, and you know, I've worked very closely with Deborah because I feel like, you know, we know from the start, nursery and reception, what's going to happen. And if our children don't leave with a set of, you know, SATs or a set of achievements and a confidence in themselves by year 6, it's almost too late. You know, the work that has to happen then in secondary to get them back on track. So for me, it's very much getting parents on board, seeing all parents, and capturing children from the start so they know what their potential is and where they can get to.
Thank you, thank you. And Dilwar, do you mind just telling us a little bit about yourself too?
Hi, so I'm one of the young governors at one of the primary schools in Hackney. And I think, Loic, what you were talking about, and what everyone's talking about, I think resonates a lot with what I'm quite passionate about. I think we spend a lot of time trying to cure these problems, but I think prevention's the best thing to do. I think sometimes getting to the root issues before they become a growing problem or before they become a financial burden. And yeah, I think as a governor, I think what we need to start doing is start asking the right questions. I think start making schools safe places for parents to talk, for children to raise concerns with adults that they trust. So I think these issues as governors are things that we need to address to our leaders. And I think in terms of what you said about policies, I think policies are important, but I think it's just as important as the person implementing the procedure. I think for me, that's what really matters. People that implement policies with integrity and with, I think with their heart. I think that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. Yeah, thank you. And really, really welcome contribution. I think that's interesting, that theme of spotting and being able to identify concerns and issues early, but then not becoming a school full of interventions as being the response, but having that robust support that is part and parcel of the school's offer. And I think, Loic, you identified some areas in which schools have responded and are able to respond. But there's some challenges to that. And I wonder if some of our panelists would like to outline some of the challenges that perhaps schools face when attempting to address the lack of equity perhaps in broader society. So I don't know, Deborah, first of all, if you had any reflections on that.
I think sometimes it's not always done with a sensitive approach, and it isn't always done with that kind of three-pronged approach. Sometimes parents are aware that their children have been asked to join groups or be part of groups, but the students know why they're there, but the parents don't necessarily know why they're there. So you may get a group of underperforming boys who have been asked to embark on X program for X amount of weeks, and that information may or may not have gone home to parents, but the boys know that on a Thursday afternoon, for example, they come out of class and they do X, Y, Z. And that for me is a deficit model, because whilst trying to support, you're actually already deciding that these boys may or may not perform, and if not, then they've all been brought together and actually they look at each other and actually, well, where's the difference here? I know why you're here and I know why you're here. So I mean, we know that young people are acutely aware about how they are perceived. And so for me, it's about communication, and sometimes opening up the dialogue between what schools are going to do and how parents can be involved, and why children may need to be targeted. It just needs to be an open conversation and an open dialogue, so that there aren't misconceptions about why maybe specific groups of students have been brought together. But when I talk about this deficit model, it sounds negative, and paradoxically, it doesn't have to be, because I know that if I've got a group of year 10 students who are going to struggle to get a grade 5 in their maths, then actually they need to be together. But what we need to do is ensure that further down, yes, at key stage 3, that we've already identified that, so they don't become this struggling group at key stage 4, whereby there may be other intersectionalities that also underpin why they are sat as a group. So just one of the barriers, communication, and parents just being really aware as to what's happening academically.
It was interesting actually, because I think Loic was talking about that group of paraprofessionals around the child and that role of bringing together that expertise in a meaningful way. But the challenges of that in terms of long meetings and getting people in at the same time and so forth, which I think is really well articulated. I don't know, Nina, if you'd be able to give a perspective from your about the challenges that schools face with this.
I was just thinking about what you were saying, Deborah, just then about interventions, and the moment you take a child out for an intervention, they miss out on something that's happening within their classroom as well. So it's you're instantly separating a group. And also children have very different perceptions about why a child has disappeared, but also why you've been taken out. And it might be a great experience. But I always, one theory I always have in school is that as much as possible, you keep your group together. And it's all the adults in the background doing all the really hard work. So children just have this smooth journey and don't see themselves as marginalised. One of the main challenges I've found really on every level is, in order to achieve equity, what I always used to say to myself was, I don't want anyone to feel like something's being taken away from them and given to another group. So that's sort of, well, if you're going to amplify this voice, what are you doing to mine? But then actually I was talking to one of my governors really recently, and I found it really helpful, because her perspective was, well, you are taking something away from another group, but that's not a bad thing. What you're doing is slightly de-amplifying a voice so that you can amplify another. But it's how to communicate that in a really positive way to, whether it's children, whether it's parents, whether it's staff, really hardworking, really involved, that they don't feel like they're not being seen and heard. So you don't lose a group to gain a group, but you keep everyone together. And that journey, I think, is a particular challenge in school.
Great, thank you. I think Dilwa, you have a very interesting perspective in terms of being a new governor, but also having come through the education system, definitely more recently than me, by the looks of it. I'm just wondering if you could share your perspective on some of the challenges that you see.
I think for me, lots of different things. I think when you're implementing interventions, I think it has to be purposeful, and it has to be adapted to the needs of the learners. I think that's for me is a key thing. I think there's no one size fits all approach, I think, for intervention and intervening with groups of young people who are at risk of underachieving. And then I think secondly, and importantly, we have to look at what the outputs and outcomes are for those groups. So are we measuring it in the same way? Are we measuring it in the same way we might measure in a different part of London or out of London compared to somewhere like Hackney in London? So I think that's one key thing that I think for me stands out. And then I think in terms of my experiences, and I wanted to speak a little bit about that, is actually being able to relate to a lot of the adults in your schools. I've just come off the back of a very stressful teachers training, as I was talking to Neela about earlier. And one of the things I noticed is that there weren't many teachers that looked and sounded like me. In fact, one of the things I got called up for was using words like yeah, and not saying yes, and pronouncing 3 and not 3 with the TH. But I think everyone knows, I think a common kind of language, a common lingo with young people is they relate to people that actually sound a bit like them. So although it might be not necessarily great to use model language such as free and not free in schools, I think it relates to young people. And I think if you can engage the learners, and if you can get them engaged and involved in their learning, I think that for me is big enough. I think good enough for me, I think. and the rest will come later.
Thank you. I remember the pain of teacher training too as well, but it's worth it in the end, I think, so we're safe to say. I think, Loic, I think that links really well to what you were talking about, being on the margins or being marginalised. And I think having a representative staffing body and having those comparators that are meaningful for different contexts are a really important part of that. Is that something that's come through your conversations with schools and other providers?
Yeah, I think it's definitely an area. Yeah, the numbers are quite stark when we look at how much staff bodies differ from the communities they serve. So I think there's a growing awareness of that, but awareness and action don't always walk in lockstep. And we know, for example, that there are some systemic issues around career progression and so on for teachers from different backgrounds. And so I think there's definitely a need to address that, whilst at the same time being able to create environments where one is able to say, look, we're all different, and we can all do a bit of code switching, and we can all relate to people, learn to relate to people who are different. And one of the nice things about Hackney, I guess, is that it's not as segregated as some other places are. And I know that Hackney schools that's a great richness of Hackney schools.
Okay, thank you. I think working with in a London schools for many years as I have, I think everybody feels like they're doing an awful lot all the time, and I think that's right. It's a very busy world. But what more could we be doing to address these challenges? What differences could we be making and considering, bearing in mind some of the areas that Loic has been talking about demarginalising schools, but also that child policy being policy responsive, and about that awareness of whether we're marginalising people or whether it's just exacerbating existing issues. I don't know, what more could we perhaps be doing, Deborah?
Well, I think one place to definitely start is the curriculum. Retrospectively, if you asked me whether I saw myself in the curriculum I studied, I'd say no. Do I see myself in the curriculum that I taught for the past 20 odd years? No. Do little black girls see themselves in the curriculum that they are taught? Well, very seldom. And if we are seen, through whose eyes, and what do those texts look like? Are the protagonists anybody that look like three of the people on this panel? I think not. And so by its very nature, the default model of the curriculum already marginalises our Black and global majority young people. So then it's not good enough for us to then keep coming back with the underperformance of specific groups of children, whether they be the Turkish boys, Black Caribbean boys, travellers. It's not enough. So when we are talking about the design of our curriculums, we need to talk truthfully and honestly whether the design of those curriculum models are able to inculcate who we serve. And it isn't just enough to go to the Black member of staff and can you recommend the book? It's incumbent on all of us. My background is English, and I remember that quite often. Deborah, can you name any Black writers? Can you I know lots of white writers, I know lots of Black writers, and that is because it's my subject area, so I've made it my business. And it should be everybody's business, therefore. And if we have a collective sense of what is out there, then actually we'll be sure to ensure that our curriculum does not by then default marginalise the kids that we serve. We are a service, we are there to serve. And if you continue to not see yourself represented in a curriculum that is supposed to be broad and robust and have depth then actually you can go through your entire school life and just think, well, you know, Black people were oppressed and we were always fighting, and actually you're marginalizing children, and they'll take those messages with them into their adulthood. And actually that's, you know, that kind of institutionalized notion of where they are positioned in society has already started at school, which is a sad thing, because the school is where we get and where we're supposed to reach our children. And if we're not reaching all of our children, then actually we are deciding the narrative that they will leave with. We are deciding the narrative that they will take away with them. And so for me, a really good starting point would be the curriculum.
Thank you. I think you've articulated that really powerfully as well in terms of the reasons behind that. And lots of schools have been undertaking that work. And I think it's really important to go back to that message as to why that is such an important aspect. Thank you. Neela, I don't know if you had an idea about that, or if there's one thing that you think would just make a real difference, both at national or local level.
I think I'm going to be a bit cheeky and cover two very quickly, but I think just leading on, Deborah, from what you just said, I think it's having that bravery with the curriculum as well, to think this is the core, we're going to teach it really well, they're going to do really well in tests, exams, but also I'm really listening and I'm really seeing. So, you know, if a group of children are saying, we want to find out more about this, we're going to help them find out a bit more. We're going to help them develop that critical eye for themselves. What has always resonated with me was when Orleen Badu talked about no child should leave themselves at the door when they're coming into the classroom or coming into the school. That always resonates with me, and I think that is in terms of the curriculum, and definitely in terms of how do they see the adults in their school. You know, what's the difference between who's supposedly at whatever the top is and who serves their lunch. And I know for myself, my own journey to headship, I still remember an interview process I had for a headship where, you know, I was told I'd done very well in all areas, but no one could really see me having a difficult conversation, or would I be able to hold anyone to account? Now, anyone here who knows me will know that I can, but I was very much seen as this sort of, you know, quiet, brown, young woman who couldn't definitely never lead a school. And that's my own experience. So I hit that ceiling, and, you know, and that's what needs to change, you know. So, you know, so Dilwar doesn't have that experience of, you know, how you pronounce things or how you say things. You know, I came from the north. I had a way of saying things as well, you know, but you know, it's about that visibility, so children can see and think, yeah, I can do that if I want to.
Right.
And this curriculum is for me.
Thank you, it's fantastic, thank you. Dilwar, if there's one thing that you think we could change to make a difference, is there something you can think of?
I think for me is, equipping young people with the skills to be able to negotiate with all people at all levels. I think young people are very much brilliant at negotiating with their friends, winning an argument, wherever it may be. But I think for them to actually start influencing policies and practices in workplaces, and maybe a change in curriculum would be actually being able to speak to someone who doesn't, who's not from their background or who's not on the same level as them. So I think being able to speak to people with purpose at all different levels and being able to negotiate. So actually looking at a set of problems and being able to say, right, we're going to have this instead of the other. So actually being able to spot those opportunities as well, I think for me is the best place to start. So actually equipping young people with the tools to negotiate. And it all starts from schools, youth clubs, you know, lots of other youth organizations that are doing great work, but I just don't think there's enough knowledge or research out there that looks at youth negotiation.
Thank you, I agree. I think that the role of oracy and a powerful curriculum is just so important because of the power that comes from having that language and that knowledge of how oracy works. Loic, was there one thing that you saw that was particularly powerful you would change?
I think I'd probably go back to my magic wand and my my team of paraprofessionals and that network around the school, so that we really engage with the fact that, you know, education is not just determined by what happens within the school gates, it's what happens outside of the school gates, it's families, it's everything else. And we can't be in a situation where, when stretched teachers and stretched heads and stretched governors reach their limit, there's not someone else there to support them. We need to have our young people held from all sides and supported regardless of their needs, so that they can build these meaningful relationships with a whole range of different people from different backgrounds, but also with different expertise and different specialisms, so that they can get what they need, and they can get it before they reach crisis point.
Thank you. Really, really powerful. And I see we have one comment in our chat, one message. I know there's many others out there listening, but I'm just appreciating that this is a platform, this is a conversation that needs to be had. There's a live conversation that needs to be heard, and obviously this is part of a long conversation that needs to happen. So thank you for that comment. It's really appreciated there. I want to thank the panelists, because I think you've been fantastic today. You've been very open, very honest in terms of your experiences, but also very wise and knowledgeable in what you're saying. So really, really appreciate you spending the time with us today. And I know you'd like to hand over for closing remarks from Councillor Bramble. So I'm hoping that Councillor Bramble is here and is able to summarise in a better way than me. Hi, Councillor Bramble, welcome.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I was just really, it's really difficult to articulate the space that I was in, because I literally have just travelled back from conference today. I was down in Harrogate. We were down there for 3-4 days. And the reason why I mentioned that is that I spent an hour with you and the panel, and you translated me through different spaces to occupy and challenge in just an hour. And I just think that when you're feeding and challenging others, and it's at the right thing at the right time, it can mean so much. I mean, Loic, understanding children is so much more powerful than all the bureaucracy that we get caught up in around so much time. And Neela saying that Hackney's got this on the table, that dialogue, it's to remind us that we are activists, that we are change makers, and that actually it reminds us of how powerful we are in that context. It reminds us, Neela, that we can affect change. I think, Deborah, you're so right that if we don't get to children early enough, and we don't look at a holistic view of when we talk about our children, and sometimes even their families, we can come to a very kind of punitive intervention stage. And gosh, it was so nice to hear from Darwa, one of our young governors. And I know that Maggie and I are always teasing each other to say, you know, who is more excited about this programme, she or I? This is exactly why this was the right programme to have young people on governing panels, because actually he brings that context that one size doesn't fit all. And what this will hopefully help us as governors to reflect on is that in the busyness of school and the everyday regime, there's a pivotal challenge and input from governors that this session around inclusion empowers and equips us all to do that. And you're so right, Darryl, you talked about young people's, I think, oh my goodness, I think my family members that are younger, if I use this word, young people call it banter. Am I allowed to say that, Darryl? Young people call it banter, and it's that engagement of jokes and playfulness that actually you're right. If you begin to listen to the nuance, if you're a teacher, you can close your ears because of the language or the slang. But if you listen to the ability to debate with children, is actually there. So it's how do we get alongside children in what they find quite naturally and put that in a format that actually enables them to not then just debate, but then negotiate and be a place to influence policy. And it's how we get out of the rigidity of education. And as a former teacher, I know and understand what that feels like, but actually how do we get alongside children and empower them? So thank you all for today. I suppose the last thing that I would say, and I know that we've had a series of sessions that were reflecting on different ways of inclusion, but coming out of the teaching profession, one of the things that I'm saying now about teaching is I think we should consider ourselves part of the creative industry, and we don't. And the reason why I say that is that when I think back to my most powerful lessons, when I think of the most powerful lessons I've observed, it was those that were creative. It was when teachers thought outside the box, where children were leading, and they were empowered. And that is a creative gift. It's a creative skill set. And I think if we start talking about teaching more alongside creative arts, I think it will empower teachers a lot more, that they won't feel like they have to sit inside the box. So I just want to thank all of the speakers for your empowerment, and you certainly left me re-engaged, and I think you've thoroughly equipped all of our teachers and governors in Hackney to just do an even more powerful job for the work that they do inside our schools. Thank you. Back to you, Chair. Thank you. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bramble. Really appreciate it. Thank you again, Loic, for your fantastic thought-provoking speech. Really helped stimulate our discussion. And thanks again to our three panelists for your input. Really appreciate it too. And also thank you to Maggie for putting forward these sessions. Really helpful, really powerful, really bring our conversation alive. And as I said before, this is a continuing conversation, not the beginning or the end. I hope you can all join us for the next one, which is next Thursday. I'm hoping Maggie's going to interrupt if I'm wrong.
Wednesday.
Thank you, Maggie. Many apologies. Next Wednesday. I hope you can all join us for that. Maggie, did you want to say something about that?
I only want to say, I mean, the joy that I get in bringing this together, you cannot imagine. It's absolutely wonderful. And today really has, you know, been a real privilege to listen to all of you share some heartfelt views on what we need to change. And it's wonderful. You know, we've captured it here today. We will share it. And we absolutely know we're going to continue this conversation that came out of this session. So I want to thank you all for that. Bid good night, well, not good night, a lovely evening to all, and we will see you next Wednesday. So thank you, one and all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.